There's something a bit funny about Avatar, The Last Airbender, and it's this. By every rule of how children's telly worked in 2005, it's a small wonder it got made at all. A serialized cartoon about a 100-year war. A story that opens on a genocide, Asian philosophy, real martial arts, a boy who wakes up to find that everyone he ever knew is gone. On Nickelodeon, of all places, somewhere between the Sponges and the Talking Dogs. And yet it did get made, and 20 years on, people are still pulling it apart, still finding new things buried in it, still arguing about what it all means at 1 a.m. when they really ought to be asleep. So that's what we're doing tonight, just wandering through all of it. The theories, the mysteries, the strange behind-the-scenes stories, the bits that were hiding in plain sight the whole time. No rush, nothing to solve. If you fancy more of these, there's a subscribe button somewhere down there. Otherwise, settle in. Let's take our time with this one. Let's start right at the beginning. Before there was a show at all. Before Aang, before Appa, before a single frame of any of it. In January of 2002, two fellas named Michael Dante DiMartino and Brian Konietzko got the nod from Nickelodeon's head of development at the time, a man called Eric Coleman, to go off and build something. And the brief they were handed was lovely and vague, action and adventure, legends and lore. That was more or less the whole of it. Go and make us something with action and adventure and legends and lore, lads. You can see why that would appeal to anyone. It's the sort of open door most people in that business spend a whole career waiting for and never get, because make no mistake, this was a strange thing to be making. Nickelodeon in the early 2000s ran on standalone episodes, shows where nothing much carried over from one week to the next, where you could drop in on any random Tuesday and miss nothing at all, because the whole point was that a kid could catch any episode in any order. What Mike and Brian wanted to make was the opposite of that. One long story, a war with a proper beginning, a middle and an end. Characters who changed, who remembered what had happened to them, who carried their scars from one season into the next. That's a normal ask for grown-up drama now. Back then on a kids' network, it was borderline reckless. If a child missed 3 episodes, would they even be able to follow it? The safe money said no. The safe money was wrong, mind you, but the safe money is always where networks like to live. So they went away and they built a pitch. And the thing they eventually put together to sell it, the little proof of concept film you make to convince the money people this is worth doing, was a test pilot, cobbled together around 2003 with the help of a Korean animation studio called Tin House. It was low budget by design. It was never meant for the telly. It was meant for a room full of executives who needed convincing, and to this day it has never actually aired. If you've ever seen it, you've seen it as a bonus feature tucked away on the old DVDs, or floating about online where it's not strictly supposed to be, usually with Mike and Brian talking over the top of it, pointing out everything they'd change. And here's the thing I find genuinely charming about that pilot. It's wrong. Not wrong in a bad way. Wrong in the way a first draft is always a bit wrong. So many of the details are just slightly off from what the show eventually became. Take Aang. In the series we all know, the Avatar state is this solemn, almost frightening thing. His eyes and his tattoos light up. He stops being quite himself. He becomes a channel for every Avatar who came before him. It's not a party trick. It costs him something. But in that early pilot, Aang more or less flips it on like a light switch. He deliberately throws himself into danger so he can trigger it, and then he uses it as a straightforward attack. An offensive move, a way to win a scrap. At one point, it apparently lets him run along the side of a giant statue, which is brilliant fun and also completely undercuts everything the Avatar state would eventually come to mean. It's the video game version of a thing that later became a proper spiritual burden. Funny how these things evolve. And Zuko, poor Zuko, had a whole animal companion of his own in that early version. A creature that trailed after him, the way Appa and Momo trail after Aang. which, if you sit with it, changes the entire flavour of the character. The Zuko we got is defined by how alone he is. He's got his uncle, and that's about it. And even that relationship is complicated for most of the run. Give him a loyal little pet, and he becomes a slightly softer, warmer figure from the off. They stripped it away, and the show is better for it, but it's a lovely glimpse of a road not taken. The map was different too. Different shape, different creatures dotted about the edges of it. The way old maps used to have sea monsters drawn in the corners. But the detail I keep coming back to, the one that really made me sit up when I first learned about it, is hiding in the pilot's opening titles. Standing behind Aang in the background as a massive stone statue is the lion turtle. Now, if you've seen the show, you'll know why that's a big deal. And if you haven't, don't worry, we'll get properly into it later. For now, all you need to know is that the lion turtle is the single most argued about thing in the entire series. It's the creature that turns up right at the very end and hands Aang the answer to his biggest problem. And for years people have complained that it came out of nowhere, that it was a cheat, that the writers wrote themselves into a corner and invented a magic turtle to climb out of it. Except it was there the whole time. It was in the title card of the pitch reel, before Nickelodeon had even said yes. Konietzko has said, more or less directly, that they weren't just using it as set dressing. They were already planning its role in the finale that far back, years before it turned up on screen, years before anyone watching had the faintest idea it existed. I love that, genuinely. Whatever you think of how the ending played out, and we will have that argument in good time, the idea that the answer was quietly sitting in the background of the very first thing they ever made is not an accident. That's a plan. That's two people who knew where their story was going before they'd even been given permission to tell it. And that really is the thread that runs through this whole show and why people won't leave it alone. It wasn't slapped together. Almost nothing in it is throwaway. The stuff that looks like set dressing usually isn't. The little symbol on a tile, the statue in someone's house, the offhand line. A startling amount of it turns out to be load-bearing. Planted early, paid off late, which is a mad thing to be true of a cartoon that got pitched with the words action and adventure, legends and lore. But there we are. And it wasn't only the pilot where the show could have gone somewhere else entirely. Some of the most beloved characters in the whole thing very nearly didn't exist in the form we know them. And the story of how they changed is one of my favourite bits of behind-the-scenes trivia. Take Toph, wonderful, blind, unbreakable Toph, who I'm going to keep insisting is my favourite character in the whole show. And I stand by that. In the earliest plans, Toph was a boy, a muscular, loud-mouthed teenage lad, a bit of a jock, designed as a foil to Sokka, and of all things, a romantic rival for Katara's affections alongside Aang. A whole love triangle, built around a beefy teenage earthbender. And then the show's head writer, a man named Aaron E. Hash, made a joke in the writer's room. He said, wouldn't it be funny if this powerhouse earthbender, this person who could flatten huge, burly grown men, was instead a tiny little blind girl? And the idea stuck. It stuck so hard it rewrote the character completely. Konietzko, one of the two creators, apparently disliked it at first and pushed back on it. And then, in one of those lovely little ironies the universe hands out now and then, Toph went on to become his favourite character in the entire show. The thing he resisted became the thing he loved most. And the old boyish version of Toph didn't just vanish either, because good ideas never really get thrown away on a well-run show. They get recycled. That muscular earthbender you see in the opening credits, the shadowy figure mid-sequence, is essentially the leftover Toph prototype. Some of that original design and personality even ended up folded into a completely different character years later, in the sequel series in the shape of a cheerful earthbending lad. So Toph, in a sense, split in two. The girl we got and the boy she used to be wandering around a different city in someone else's story a generation later. Azula was going to be a man too. Zuko's terrifying prodigy of a sister started life as a brother, with a name that was going to be simply Azul, which, when you think about how much of the final stretch of the show leans on the specific relationship between two sisters and their mother, on Azula and Ursa, and that whole knot of grief and rivalry, feels almost unthinkable now. The story we ended up with is so shaped by who these characters became that it's truly strange to picture the earlier drafts where half of them were somebody else entirely. That's the thing about a show made this carefully. The version you love is one path out of hundreds they could have taken, and most of those other paths are still lying around in old design folders and abandoned pitch notes, reused, hidden in the corners of the show you actually got. So that's where it comes from. A vague brief, a scrappy little test film full of ideas that weren't quite right yet, and a giant turtle hiding in the background, waiting for its moment. From there, they actually had to build the world. And when you look at how they built it, what they reached for, what they borrowed, what they got right down to the fingertips, that's where it starts to get properly interesting. Here's a detail I think about more than a grown adult probably should. In Avatar, you can tell where a character is from just by watching them move. Not by the colour of their clothes, not by the accent, not by anything they say, by how they fight. And that's not a happy accident. That's a decision somebody made very early and very deliberately. And it's one of the reasons the show still looks better than things made 20 years after it. The 4 bending styles aren't invented. They're based on real martial arts. Actual living, practiced for centuries Chinese fighting styles, chosen because each one felt like the element it would come to represent. The man who worked all this out for the show was a martial artist named Sifu Kisu, and the original plan, before he came along, was apparently to make up brand new fighting styles from scratch for each nation. Thank goodness that idea got binned, because what they did instead is so much richer. So, waterbending is Tai Chi, and once you know that, you can't unsee it. Tai Chi is all soft, flowing, circular motion. It's less about strength and more about alignment, breath, and structure. It's slow. It redirects rather than resists. It hides a deep, almost hidden strength inside all that gentleness, which is a lovely way of describing water when you think about it. Water doesn't fight the rock. It just goes around it, patiently, for a few thousand years, and the rock loses. Watch Katara move, and you're watching someone borrow their opponent's force and turn it back on them, which is Tai Chi to the bone. Earthbending is Hung Gar, which is a southern style built on low-rooted, immovable stances and strong direct hand strikes. The name roughly translates to something like immense fist, which tells you everything. Where a waterbender flows around an attack, an earthbender plants their feet and takes it, then hits back head-on. They endure rather than evade. That's why earthbenders in the show always look so solid, so dug in, so hard to knock over. They're standing in stances that in real life take students literal years to build the strength to hold. There's a version of Hung Gar training where you spend hours in a low horse stance until your legs stop being legs and start being furniture. Perfect for people who move rock. Firebending is Northern Shaolin. Fast, aggressive, long range, all sharp kicks and sudden advances and quick retreats. It's the most outwardly explosive of the styles, which suits fire, obviously, but there's a cleverer bit underneath. Fire has many faces. Controlled, it's one thing. Out of control, it becomes something else entirely. Something that can turn on the person wielding it. And that's baked into how firebenders are written, isn't it? The ones who fight on pure rage and hatred, like early Zuko, are dangerous but sloppy. The ones who actually master it, who treat it as discipline rather than temper, become terrifying. The martial art was chosen to carry that whole idea before a word of dialogue ever said it out loud. Airbending is Bagwajang, which is the one people forget the name of but recognise instantly on screen. It's all spinning, circling, evasive footwork. You move around your opponent rather than through them, endlessly, never quite where they expect you to be. It's the least aggressive of the four, which fits a culture of pacifist monks, and it's why Aang spends most of the series trying very hard not to hurt anyone. He's fighting in a style that was literally designed to avoid contact. And then there's Toph, who gets her own thing, because of course she does. Her style pulls from southern praying mantis, a close-range, sharp, aggressive form, which is a gorgeous little irony when you remember she's blind. She sees by feeling vibrations through the ground, so she waits, perfectly still, reads exactly where you are through the soles of her feet, and then strikes with total precision. A blind girl who never misses because she's not really using her eyes at all. No notes. Best character in the show, and I will not be taking questions. Even the smaller stuff has a real-world root. Tai Li, the cheerful acrobat who fights by jabbing people until their arms stop working, is drawing on Chin Na, which is a real practice of joint locks and pressure point strikes meant to disable an opponent by cutting off their control of their own body. She's chai blocking in the show's language. In ours, she's doing something a real martial artist could point at and name. Now, the fighting is only half of it. The cultures are the other half, and they're just as carefully sourced. The water tribes draw heavily on Inuit and other Arctic peoples, right down to the architecture and the clothing and the way they live with the ice, rather than against it. The air nomads are basically Tibetan monks with a bit of Shaolin thrown in, all mountaintop temples and detachment and spiritual discipline. The Earth Kingdom and the Fire Nation pull from across China and Japan and beyond, in the food, the clothes, the buildings, the politics. And the writing you see on screen, the signs and the scrolls, and the labels, isn't gibberish. It's real Chinese calligraphy. Someone actually wrote it, properly, so that if you can read it, it says something. That's the bit that gets me. They could have scribbled some made-up runes and no child would ever have known the difference. Instead, they got the real thing correct, on the assumption that somewhere out there, someone would care enough to check. And of course, eventually, someone always did. What all of this adds up to is a world that feels borrowed from somewhere real because it was. And when you build a world that carefully, out of that many living traditions, you're not just making it look nice, you're smuggling in everything those traditions carry with them. The history, the philosophy, and as it turns out, the wars and the show didn't just borrow these styles out of a book either. The man who worked them all out, Sifu Kisu, was a real practicing martial artist who ran his own school, and he actually choreographed and performed the moves so the animators could study genuine human motion and build the bending on top of it. That's why the fighting has a weight and a correctness to it that most animated action simply doesn't. When a character shifts their stance before an attack, that shift is real. When the footwork flows one way and the strike comes the other, that's a real principle from a real art, captured and drawn. There's a whole behind-the-scenes featurette on the old discs where you can watch him demonstrate it, style by style, and once you've seen the genuine movement sitting underneath the cartoon, you can't unsee how much care went into every single punch and step. Most shows animate a cool-looking fight. This one animated a real one, and then added the magic afterward. And I can't talk about how carefully this world was built without talking about how it sounds. Because the music is doing just as much heavy lifting as the fighting. The score came from a pair of composers working under the name The Track Team, chiefly a man named Jeremy Zuckerman. And rather than reach for the usual big, brassy orchestral cartoon sound, they went and did the harder thing. Zuckerman actually spent time learning from musicians who play traditional Chinese instruments, so that the music of the world would come from the same place everything else did. The result is a soundtrack full of instruments most Western cartoons wouldn't go anywhere near. These reedy, plucked, breathy sounds that feel properly rooted in the cultures the show is borrowing from. And, just like the martial arts, the music tells you where you are without a word being spoken. The Water Tribe has its own sound, cold and spare and echoing. The Fire Nation has a heavier, more percussive, more military feel. Each nation carries a musical fingerprint, so that even with your eyes shut, you'd have a fair guess at which part of the world you'd wandered into. It's the same trick as the fighting, pulled off in a completely different sense, which is a slightly obsessive level of consistency for a children's show, and exactly the sort of obsession that makes people fall in love with a thing and never quite fall back out of it. There's a lovely knock-on effect to all this as well. Years later, when the show turned up on streaming and a whole new generation found it, the music got its own second life. That little song we'll come to in a bit, the one an old man sings on a hillside, had people flocking to look up the words online decades after it first aired. A children's cartoon lullaby, doing the rounds of the internet, long after everyone involved had moved on. That doesn't happen to disposable music. It happens to music somebody bled over, which is a slightly ominous place to leave it. So let's go there next, because underneath all that lovely culture, this cartoon was secretly telling a much darker story than it ever let on. So here's a thing people who grew up with the show sometimes forget, and people who never watched it flat out don't believe. Avatar is more or less a story about a world war, and not in a vague, hand-wavy, there's a bad guy sense. In a proper, structured, this maps onto real history sense. The read that's been kicking around the fandom for years is that the original series is essentially the Second World War with the serial numbers filed off. Think about how it's set up. You've got one nation, the Fire Nation, that decides it is simply better than everyone else and sets out to conquer or subjugate the rest of the world. The other nations either fight back in secret or bow their heads and try to survive under occupation. There's an aggressor with an ideology of superiority, there's an empire on the march, and there's 100 years of the whole world being ground down underneath it. That's not a subtle allegory, that's just the plot. And once you're looking at it through that lens, the little details start jumping out. Sokka gets a sword in the 3rd season, a beautiful black blade, and it's forged from a meteorite that fell out of the sky. A weapon from space, made from something that dropped to Earth. There's a real-world flavour to that, this idea of forces beyond the ordinary bleeding into a war story. Fans have even pointed at one particular incident and gone, hang on, there's a moment where the ambitious Admiral Zhao sneaks men aboard Zuko's ship to sabotage it and end his rival's quest, and the ship goes down. And people have noticed how closely that rhymes with the real attack on the American warship, the USS Cole, in the year 2000, where attackers got to a military vessel and killed sailors aboard it. The real ship stayed afloat, and Zuko's didn't, so it's hardly a documentary, but the shape of it is close enough that fans clocked it. Whether the writers meant it or whether it's just the kind of thing that happens when you write a serious war story, I couldn't tell you. But it's the sort of echo this show throws off constantly, because it took its war seriously. And then there's the sequel, The Legend of Korra, which does the same trick with a different era. If the first show is the World War, Korra is everything that came afterward. It jumps forward decades into a world of motorcars and radios and skyscrapers and industry, and each of its 4 seasons wrestles with a different big political idea. There's a season about revolution and class resentment, the have-nots rising up against the benders who've always had the power. There's a season that circles around anarchism and one that flirts with fascism and totalitarian control. Fans have long described the 2 shows together as this neat little march through modern history. The first one is the Great War, the second one is the uneasy century that follows, all Cold War tension and competing ideologies, and the sense that beating one tyrant doesn't magically make the world simple. Which, honestly, is a fairly grown-up thing to teach a child. Winning the war is the easy part. Working out what to do with the peace is where it all gets hard. What I find rather remarkable about all this is where it was happening. This was a Saturday morning sort of a show. It ran on a network built for laughs and toys and merchandise, and tucked inside it was a serious meditation on imperialism, on genocide, on how ordinary people get swept up in the machinery of a war they didn't start. The Fire Nation isn't just a faceless evil empire either. That's the clever bit. You spend a whole season inside it, in ordinary Fire Nation towns, with ordinary Fire Nation kids in school, and you realise most of them are just people. People who've been told a story their whole lives about how their nation is spreading greatness to the world, when it's actually spreading misery. There's a moment where the propaganda gets laid out so plainly, it's almost uncomfortable. This idea that the aggressor genuinely believes it's the hero of its own story, that it's sharing its gifts, that the people resisting are the unreasonable ones. That's a heavy thing to hand a 9-year-old. And the show does it without ever slowing down to lecture. It just lets you sit inside the empire for a bit, until you understand how empires convince their own people to go along with terrible things. Sort of like how, growing up, you slowly realise the version of history you got taught as a kid had a few convenient gaps in it, and you spend your 20s filling them back in. I think that's really why The Thing has lasted. Loads of children's shows are fun. Very few of them are about anything. This one was about the biggest, oldest, ugliest thing there is, which is what people do to each other when one group decides it deserves to rule the rest. And it dressed that up in flying bison and magic water and a boy with an arrow on his head, so that you'd absorb it without noticing you were absorbing it. And the sequel really doubles down on that political streak, to the point where you can read each of its 4 seasons as a different dangerous idea taken to its extreme. The first big villain is a masked revolutionary who wants to strip the benders of their power in the name of equality, playing on the very real resentment of the ordinary, non-bending people who've always lived beneath them. It's a story about how a genuine grievance can be twisted into something monstrous. The second season goes spiritual and apocalyptic, all chaos and imbalance and the danger of one fanatical vision of order imposed on the world. The third hands you an anarchist, a man who sincerely believes the world would be freer with no leaders and no governments at all, and who is, unsettlingly, one of the most charismatic and philosophically coherent villains the whole franchise ever produced. And the final season gives you a militarist, a woman who unites a broken nation through force and control and the promise of stability, sliding by degrees into full-blown fascism. Equality, chaos, anarchy, and fascism. 4 seasons, 4 ideologies, each presented not as cartoon evil, but as a seductive answer to a real problem, which is precisely what makes each one dangerous. That is a startlingly grown-up curriculum to smuggle into a program with a flying bison in it. It's practically a first-year politics course wearing a children's cartoon as a disguise, and most of the kids watching just thought they were getting cool fights, which, to be fair to them, they also were. Which brings us to the part that surprises people most of all. Because when I say this show went to dark places, I don't mean it in a gentle, implied off-screen sort of way. I mean it went to some bleak places on purpose for kids, and somehow got most of it past the people whose entire job was to stop that happening. Right, let's talk about the dark stuff. Not to be grim about it, and I promise we're going to keep this gentle, but you can't really understand why people take this show as seriously as they do without acknowledging just how far it was willing to go. Start with the very first thing, the whole premise. Aang wakes up after 100 years frozen in an iceberg, and the first big gut punch of the story is that his entire people are gone. Not scattered, not hiding, gone. The air nomads, the culture that raised him, every monk who ever taught him, every friend he ever had, wiped out in a single coordinated attack while he was asleep in the ice. It's a genocide. The show uses that word's weight even when it doesn't use the word. Aang is the last of his kind, a survivor of an atrocity, carrying a grief so enormous that for a while he simply refuses to believe it happened. And that's the foundation the entire cheerful adventure is built on top of. Every yip-yip and every goofy soccer joke is sitting on a bedrock of loss, and it doesn't stop there. Katara and Sokka's mother was killed by the Fire Nation when they were small, and the show comes back to that wound more than once, because that's how grief actually works. It doesn't resolve in one tidy episode. There's Zuko, whose own father burned him across the face when he was a child in front of a crowd as a punishment for speaking out of turn. That scar he wears the whole series isn't makeup. It's child abuse, plainly stated, from a parent to a kid. And the show doesn't flinch from what that does to a person over a lifetime. Then there's Azula, Zuko's sister, who might be the most quietly devastating thing in the whole story. She starts as this flawless, terrifying prodigy, the golden child, all control and precision. And across the final stretch, you watch her come apart. The paranoia, the isolation, the sense of a mind turning against itself until she's hallucinating and sobbing and utterly alone, is one of the most careful depictions of a psychological breakdown I've seen in any animation, let alone one aimed at children. And they let it play out without softening it, without a magic cure, without a neat little bow. Some people just break, the show says, and it's terrible to watch, and it's nobody's happy ending. There's more. There's an Earth Kingdom general who tries to force Aang into a rage by putting Katara in mortal danger, essentially torturing his friend to weaponize him. There's an episode in a foggy swamp where the characters are tormented by visions of their dead loved ones, the people they've lost appearing and vanishing at the edge of sight. And there's Hama, an old waterbender, who teaches Katara a technique called bloodbending, which is exactly as horrible as it sounds. You bend the water inside a living body. You take control of a person like a puppet, against their will, by seizing the blood in their veins. The show introduces it as a genuine horror, a power so violating that even learning it feels like a stain. And all of this builds toward the ending, which raises the darkest question the show ever asks. When the day of the Great Comet arrives, the Fire Lord isn't just trying to win the war anymore. He's decided to burn the rest of the world to ash. A genocidal campaign out in the open to end everyone who isn't him. Which means Aang, this gentle boy raised by pacifist monks who has spent the entire series refusing to take a life, is now the only thing standing between one man and the end of the world. And the obvious solution, the one everyone around him keeps pushing, is simple. You have to kill him. There's no other way. It's him or everyone. And Aang can't, won't. Everything he is, everything his lost culture stood for, rebels against it. He'd rather find another way than betray the last thing his people ever taught him. Which is a beautiful stance and also a completely maddening one when the fate of the world is on the line. And the show absolutely knows that. It puts the argument right in front of you. Is it noble to keep your hands clean? Or is it selfish, when clean hands might cost everyone else their lives? People still argue about it. I go back and forth on it myself, depending on my mood. I'll say this for it though, a lesser show would have dodged the question. It would have had Ozai conveniently trip over a cliff, or had someone else do the dirty work off screen, so the hero never had to face it. Avatar makes Aang stand in the middle of that impossible choice and refuses to let him off easy, and the answer it eventually reaches for is genuinely strange and genuinely divisive, and it involves that giant turtle we mentioned right at the start. There's one moment in particular that I think proves how far the show was willing to go, and it lands at the end of the second season. For most of that season, Zuko has been slowly, painfully inching toward becoming a better person, toward choosing his uncle's path over his father's. And in the finale, in a beautiful, terrible scene deep beneath the great Earth Kingdom city, he's handed a clear choice. Turn away from the Fire Nation and everything it's done, or go back to it, and he chooses wrong. He betrays his uncle, sides with his sister, and helps the villains win. It's one of the darkest gut punches in the whole run, precisely because you'd spent a season believing he was finally about to turn the corner, and instead he takes an enormous step backward. And in that same sequence, Aang, the hero, the last hope of the entire world, is struck down by a bolt of Azula's lightning, and for a moment actually dies. He's revived, but the show doesn't soften the blow of it. The good guys lose, the city falls, the hero is nearly killed, and the one character who seemed ready for redemption instead damns himself. A lot of shows would never let a season end on a defeat that total, especially a show for children. Avatar just went, no, sometimes the bad guys win around, and you're going to have to sit with that over the long break before the next one. Cruel, honestly. Cruel and completely correct. And yet here's the thing that makes that betrayal land so hard and matter so much. Zuko doesn't stay fallen. What follows across the third season is what an enormous number of people will tell you is the single best redemption arc in all of television. And I'm honestly not sure they're wrong. Because it's slow. It's genuinely earned. He doesn't wake up one morning reformed and forgiven. He wrestles with it, backslides, gets it wrong, sits in his own shame, and claws his way toward becoming a better person, one difficult step at a time. He has to actually go to the people he wronged and be turned away before he's let in. The show refuses to hand him an easy forgiveness, because easy forgiveness would be a lie, and the whole point of Zuko is that changing who you are is the hardest work there is. That's why people love him. Not because he's good, but because you watched him choose to become good, painfully, against everything his father built into him. Set that beside the betrayal we just talked about, and you've got the whole shape of the boy. He fell about as far as the show would let him, and then he climbed all the way back. And the climb is the best thing in the series. So let's finally talk about the turtle. Because whether it was a stroke of genius or the biggest cheat in the whole series is a fight the fandom has been happily having for the better part of 20 years. And I don't think it's ever going to end. So the solution Aang lands on, the way out of the impossible choice, is this. He doesn't kill the Fire Lord. Instead, he takes his bending away, strips the man of his fire entirely, leaves him powerless, which is arguably a worse fate than death for someone whose whole identity is built on power. And the technique he uses to do it, this ancient thing called energy bending, he learns from a giant creature he meets shortly before the final battle, the lion turtle. The one from the statue in the pilot, all those years earlier. Here's the complaint. For a lot of people, that felt like a cheat. Aang spends the entire series stuck on this problem, insisting there has to be another way, while everyone tells him there isn't. And then, right at the death, a colossal mystical turtle he's never met before wanders in, hands him a brand new superpower nobody has ever mentioned, and solves the unsolvable problem for him. That's the textbook definition of what people call a deus ex machina, a god from the machine. The convenient outside force that swoops in to untangle a knot the story couldn't untangle, honestly. And once you see it that way, it's hard to unsee. It can feel like the writers wanted Aang to keep his hands clean, couldn't find a fair way to let him, and reached for a magic turtle to bail themselves out. I get that. I really do. The first time I watched it, some part of me went, hang on, where did this thing come from? But here's the case for the defense, and it's a good one, because it turns out the writers saw this coming and left themselves a very long paper trail. The lion turtle wasn't a last-minute invention. We already know it was in the background of the pilot as a statue before the show even existed. But it's not just there. It's threaded all the way through the series if you know to look. It shows up as a design on one of the little tiles in the Order of the White Lotus, the secret society of wise old folk. It gets mentioned by name deep in the second season when the characters visit a vast spirit library run by an all-knowing owl. There are statues of it in the home of Piando, the swordmaster who trains Sokka. It's dotted about the world for 2 whole seasons, tucked in the corners, the way that show plants everything. So the creatures' grand entrance in the finale is sudden, sure, but it's the entrance of something that had been haunting the edges of the map the entire time. Konietzko has been quite firm on this. The abilities weren't made up on the spot. They'd been developed long before anyone met the thing on screen. And if you want the full origin, the sequel actually goes back and explains it. There's a two-part story in The Legend of Korra called Beginnings, about the very first Avatar, a man named One, thousands of years earlier. And it's one of the most beautiful things in either show. It shows a world where the lion turtles were enormous, ancient guardians who literally carried entire cities on their backs, sheltering humanity from the dangers of a wild spirit world. And it was the lion turtles who first gave bending to humans at all, lending them the power of an element temporarily when they went out into the wilds, then taking it back when they returned home. So bending, this whole magic system the entire franchise runs on, originally came from these creatures, which means the turtle handing Aang a strange old power in the finale isn't some random miracle. It's the oldest source of bending in the world doing the exact thing it was always able to do. Suddenly it's not a cheat, it's a homecoming. So where do I land? Honestly, somewhere in the middle. I think the groundwork is real, and the ending earns more credit than the grumps give it. But I also think that even a well-planted answer can arrive a bit too neatly, and Aang gets rescued from his dilemma just a touch too cleanly, for my taste. Both things can be true. It's foreshadowed and it's still a little convenient. That's allowed. And to be fair to Aang, his refusal isn't stubbornness for its own sake. It's set up long before the finale ever arrives. He's the last of a people of monks who held all life sacred, and the show spends 3 whole seasons steadily establishing that this is the one line he will not cross, no matter the cost. So when everyone around him insists there's no other way, he isn't being naive. He's being the last living representative of an entire murdered philosophy, refusing to let the people who destroyed it also destroy the thing it stood for. Seen that way, the search for a third option isn't a plot problem to be solved. It's the whole moral spine of his character, and the turtle, whatever you make of it, is really just the universe finally meeting him where he'd been standing all along. And here's the part that keeps me up: the road not taken. The show's head writer, a man named Aaron Ahash, had ideas for a 4th season that never happened, and one of them dug right into this. His thought was that taking someone's bending shouldn't be clean and consequence-free, that when you strip that power out of another person, you have to carry their energy inside you afterward. And he wanted a season where Aang is left holding all of the Fire Lord's dark, angry, poisonous energy, at risk of being slowly corrupted and infected by it, having to learn to carry it and process it and eventually let it go. As an allegory, apparently, for how all of us end up carrying the anger and the burdens we absorb from the world around us. We never got that season, and I think about it a lot, because it would have taken the very thing people call a cop-out and turned it into the hardest, heaviest arc in the whole series. The victory that quietly poisons the hero. That's the version in my head now, and I can't get it out. And it's worth pausing on just how much of an event that ending actually was, because the finale wasn't a normal episode at all. The whole thing was built as a feature-length, 4-part climax, aired as a 2-hour television movie, 3 years of storytelling landing all at once. That's the stage this argument is happening on. Not a throwaway chapter tossed off at the end, but the biggest, most deliberate thing the show ever made. The moment everything had been building toward from the very first frame. Which for me, tips the scales a little further toward the writer's side. You don't spend 3 years carefully seeding a creature into tiles and libraries and background statues, and then structure your entire series so everything converges on one enormous 2-hour event, only to fumble the actual solution by accident at the last second. Whatever else you want to say about the turtle, it wasn't careless. It was the most carefully planned moment in a show that planned everything. You're allowed to dislike where it landed, but nobody stumbled into it. Anyway, enough about turtles and endings. because the saddest, quietest, loveliest story in the whole show has nothing to do with any of the big battles. It's about an old man, a cup of tea, and a song. There's an episode in the second season called The Tales of Ba Sing Se, and it's a bit of an odd one out. Most of the show is one big propulsive story, always pushing forward. But this episode stops. It just breathes for a while. It's 6 little vignettes, 6 short glimpses of a single day in the Big Earth Kingdom city, each one following a different character as they go about ordinary life. The girls have a spa day, Sokka wanders into a poetry club by accident and can't get out. Aang helps a struggling zookeeper. Small, warm human stuff, no world at stake for once. It's the kind of episode that reminds you these are people, not just soldiers in a war. And in the middle of it, there's the tale of Iroh. Iroh, if you don't know him, is Zuko's uncle, a retired old general. Tea-obsessed, endlessly patient, forever nudging his angry nephew toward being a better man than his father. He's the warm heart of the whole show, the sort of uncle everyone wishes they had. And his little segment in this episode is quiet and lovely. He spends the day helping people around the city. He comforts a crying child. He talks a would-be mugger out of his own bad decisions, and then gently teaches him how to make a better cup of tea. Just an old man being kind over and over to strangers. And then, at the end of his day, we understand what all of it was leading to. He climbs a hill, sets out a little cloth on the ground, lays down a picture, and lights some incense. It's a memorial. Today would have been the birthday of his son, Lu Ten, who died years ago in the war, during the siege of that very city. Losing his boy is the thing that broke Iroh open and turned him from a conquering general into the gentle soul we know. He sits by the small shrine, and he wishes his son a happy birthday, and he tells him how proud he is, and he starts to sing. The song is a soft little tune called Leaves from the Vine. In the world of the show, it's meant to be a Fire Nation children's rhyme, a lullaby, something about a little soldier boy coming home, and Iroh sings it to his dead son, and partway through he can't finish it, because he's crying, and so are you, because you're a human being with a functioning heart. Now, here's the part that turns a beautiful scene into something almost unbearable. Iroh was voiced by an actor named Mako Iwamatsu, a wonderful, gravelly, warm-voiced performer who'd been working for decades, and by the time they were making this stretch of the show, Mako was very ill. He had esophageal cancer. He recorded his final work on the series, and then, in 2006, before the episode even reached television, he passed away. So this episode, this quiet little tale of an old man singing to the son he lost, ends with a single line of text on the screen. In honour of Mako. Sit with the shape of that for a second. It's a story about a father grieving a son he outlived, performed by a man who was, at that very moment, dying himself. The grief in Iroh's voice as he sings isn't only Iroh's grief. There's a real man in there near the end of his own life, singing a lullaby about coming home. I don't know how deliberate any of that was, how much anyone in the room knew when they recorded it. But the result is one of the most genuinely moving few minutes of animation ever put to film. And it lands the way it does precisely because the sadness underneath it was real. Mako couldn't be replaced, of course, but the show still had a lot of Iroh left to voice. So the role passed to another actor, a man named Greg Baldwin, who does a remarkable job of matching Mako's voice so closely you'd struggle to hear the join. But there's one thing Greg Baldwin has said he will never do, and I think it's the loveliest bit of the whole story. He won't sing Leaves from the Vine. That song was Mako's. That performance, that specific piece of grief, belongs to the man who first gave it, and out of respect, his successor simply leaves it alone. Some things you don't cover, some things you let stand exactly as they were. I'm not going to sit here and recite the words to you, partly because they belong to the people who wrote them, and partly because it's the kind of song that's better remembered than repeated. But if you've heard it, you know. And if you haven't, you'll come across it one day, probably when you least expect it, and it'll stop you where you stand. That's the thing about this show. It could do the enormous, world-ending, comet-in-the-sky stuff. But its very best moment is an old man, alone on a hill, singing to a photograph. No spectacle, just a person and their loss. No notes. Honestly, no notes. The rest of that episode is lovely too, in a much lighter key, and that's part of what makes the Iroh piece hit so hard. You've got Sokka blundering into a formal poetry contest and, being Sokka, somehow half winning it on sheer cheek. You've got the two youngest girls having a daft, sweet day at a spa. You've got Aang causing havoc while trying to help a struggling zookeeper. Little slices of ordinary life, funny and warm and low stakes. And then, dropped right into the middle of all that gentle comedy, is a man grieving his dead son so completely he can't finish a lullaby. The contrast is the whole point. Life goes on being small and silly all around the grief, which is exactly how grief actually works. The world doesn't stop for it. People are still getting spa treatments and losing poetry contests while your heart is breaking on a hillside somewhere. Critics and fans have pretty much universally agreed this is one of the finest things the show ever did, and the Iroh tale in particular gets singled out again and again as a high point of the entire run. Which is remarkable when you remember it's essentially a 5-minute detour with no bearing on the main plot. It doesn't advance the war. It doesn't shuffle any pieces around the board. It just stops and grieves and trusts you to sit with it. Most shows would never dare hand 5 whole minutes to something that doesn't push the story forward. This one understood that sometimes the thing that doesn't move the story along is the exact thing people will remember for the rest of their lives. Speaking of loss, and of the people this show quietly grieves, there's one absence that hangs over the whole story and never gets answered on screen at all. A mother who simply vanished. And the story of what happened to her is a strange one. For most of Avatar, Zuko's mother is a ghost. Her name is Ursa, and she's the one warm figure in his childhood. The person who loved him when his father didn't, and his sister was already turning cruel. And at some point when Zuko was a boy, she simply disappeared. Gone in the night. No explanation, no body, no answer. Zuko spends a chunk of the series haunted by her, and the show, maddeningly, gorgeously, never tells you what happened to her. It just lets the wound sit there, open, for the whole run. Where did she go? Is she alive? Did she leave? Or was she taken, or worse? For years, that was one of the great unanswered questions of the fandom, right up there with anything else. Fans came up with everything. She was in hiding. She was living in the spirit world. She'd secretly become another character in disguise. People will always fill a silence, and the show left them a very big silence to fill. And then, years after it ended, the answer finally came. Not in the show, but in a comic. Avatar carried on in a series of graphic novels, proper canon continuations written with the creator's blessing, and one of them from 2013 is called The Search. Its entire job is to solve this exact mystery. And I have to say, for a mystery that sat unanswered for so long, the answer they came up with is a proper piece of tragedy. Here's the shape of it. Before she was ever a Fire Nation princess, Ursa was just a young woman from a small town, in love with a local lad named Ikem, part of a little theatre troupe with him. Happy, but she had royal blood she didn't ask for. Her own grandfather was Avatar Roku, the Avatar before Aang, and the old Fire Lord, Zuko's grandfather, Azulun, had been told that mixing his bloodline with Roku's would produce powerful descendants who'd secure his family's grip on the throne. So Ursa was essentially plucked out of her happy little life and forced into a marriage with Ozai, a cold and ambitious man she didn't love, to breed a stronger royal line, which is a grim start to anyone's story. It gets grimmer. Years later, Azulon, in a fit of cruelty, orders Ozai to kill his own son, young Zuko, so that Ozai might understand the pain of losing a child. And Ozai, being who he is apparently willing to do it. Ursa steps in to save her boy's life the only way she can. She was an apothecary before all this. She knows her plants and her poisons, and she brews an untraceable poison. The deal she strikes is monstrous in its arithmetic. Ozai gets to remove Azulon and take the throne for himself. In exchange, Zuko lives. She trades a murder for her son's life, and for that, for the poisoning, and for the treason of it, she's banished. Sent away forever, which is why the boy woke up one morning to find his mother simply gone. And what happened to her after? This is the part I find truly haunting. She was given a new face and a new life, and crucially, her memories were taken from her. She built a whole new existence, married Ikem after all, the man she'd loved before any of this, had another child, a little girl, and lived quietly with no idea who she used to be. The mother Zuko was searching for the whole time was out there, alive, content, and no longer even remembered she'd had him. Eventually, those memories are restored to her, and there's a reunion, and later she even gets to stand in front of a defeated, imprisoned Ozai and look at him without a scrap of fear left, and see him for what he really is, a small, small man. After everything he took from her, she just walks away from him. I love that she gets that. She earned it. So the mystery got its answer, and it's a good one, and it's the kind of answer only comics could really deliver, because the show would never have had time. But here's what I find interesting about the whole business. Not every mystery got tied off like that. The show, and the material after it, is quite deliberate about which questions to answer and which to leave hanging. Because Azula, Zuko's sister, the one who came apart so completely at the end, never really gets a resolution. After her breakdown, she more or less vanishes from the tidy version of the story. We don't get a neat account of whether she was ever put back together, whether she and her mother ever reconciled, whether there was any peace for her at all. Her fate is left deliberately open, a loose thread the creators chose not to pull. And I think that's the right call, honestly. Some characters you resolve, some you leave in the fog, because the fog is more honest. A tidy redemption for Azula would have felt like a lie. Leaving her uncertain feels true. That's the balance this show, and its afterlife always seemed to understand. Answer the mother, because that grief was Zuko's to heal. Leave the sister, because some wounds don't close, and pretending they do is the cheaper move. That missing mother, by the way, is only one thread in a much bigger web of stories that carried on well after the show itself ended. Because the world didn't stop when the credits rolled on the final battle. It continued quite substantially in a run of graphic novels, proper canonical continuations made with the creator's blessing, and they fill in an enormous amount of what came after. There's one about the immediate aftermath of the war, dealing with the messy, unglamorous business of what you actually do with 100 years of conquered territory once the fighting stops. It turns out you can't just hand everything back and call it even. There are whole colonies of Fire Nation people who've lived on Earth Kingdom land for generations, who have nowhere else to call home. And the story wrestles honestly with the fact that undoing an empire is far harder than defeating one. That thread matters more than it looks too, because those tangled colonies are the seed of something big. They eventually grow into the United Republic, the melting pot nation with its great city at its heart, which is the entire setting of the sequel series. So a comic about the awkward politics of the post-war cleanup is slowly laying the foundation for a show that wouldn't arrive for years. Another of these books turns its attention to Toph and her difficult relationship with her own family, the wealthy parents who never understood her, and to the founding of the city that becomes the beating heart of the next generation. So the comics aren't just filling gaps for the sake of it, they're building the bridge between the two shows, one graphic novel at a time, carrying the world forward through the quiet years when it wasn't on television at all. For a story people assume ended back in 2008, an awful lot kept happening. Of course, where the official story leaves a gap, the fans rush in. And Avatar has one of the most tireless, creative, borderline obsessive fandoms in all of animation. So let's spend a bit of time in the theories. Some of them are nonsense. Some of them turned out to be eerily correct. I want to be honest and upfront here, because it matters. Everything in this section is a fan theory. None of it is official, none of it is confirmed by the people who made the show, and I'll flag as we go which ones the creators have nodded at, and which are pure invention. But the reason Avatar fans keep spinning these things out is that the world is built so tightly that almost any theory you throw at it seems to stick. That's the mark of really good world building. There are no obvious loose ends to trip over, so every gap feels like it might be hiding something. Let's start with a big one, because it's my favourite, and because it's the kind of theory that makes the whole saga sadder and then a little bit hopeful. You'll remember the air nomads were wiped out. Genocide, the lot of them, with Aang as the sole survivor. Except by the time of the sequel series, generations later, airbenders start appearing again. Out of nowhere, ordinary people around the world suddenly find they can bend air during a big spiritual event. And the official reason is a shift in the world's energy. But fans have a better one. What if the genocide was never quite total? What if, when the attack came, some air nomads survived, fled into the towns and cities, hid their identities, stopped practicing their culture to stay alive, and started families? Their airbending would fade over the generations, dormant, buried in the bloodline, waiting. And then, when the spiritual energy of the world shifted, it woke back up in their descendants. There's a lovely bit of support for this, actually. Aang's own son, Bumi, who was born a non-bender his whole life, suddenly gains airbending as an old man during that event. So the potential was clearly sitting there, sleeping all along. I find that theory really moving because of what it means. It means the attempt to erase a people didn't fully succeed, that the culture went underground and survived in the blood and came back generations later to reclaim itself. A genocide that lost in the very long run. I don't know if it's what the writers intended, but I'd like it to be true. Here's a darker one, and this is pure fan speculation. So take it with a large pinch of salt. In the sequel, one of the original characters, Sokka, is simply gone, dead before the new story begins, and the show never fully explains how. And there's a theory that ties his death to a moment when the new Avatar, Korra, was a small child, and a group of dangerous extremists called the Red Lotus tried to kidnap her. Somebody had to protect her that day, and some fans reckon it was Sokka, and that he died doing it, giving his life to keep a little girl safe so she could grow up to save the world. There's no proof. It's the fandom filling a silence again, but it's the kind of ending that fits Sokka so well. The ordinary guy with no bending, who is always the bravest one in the room, that people would rather believe it than not. Then there are the theories about Iroh, the tea uncle from earlier. Throughout the show he's got this uncanny, deep understanding of the spirit world, far beyond what a retired general has any business knowing. And fans have long theorised that, at some point in his life, in his grief after losing his son, he actually travelled into the spirit world himself, walked among the spirits, and came back changed. The show gently supports this one actually, more than most. It hints that Iroh's connection to that other realm is real and earned. And by the end of the sequel, well, let's just say Iroh's story finds a home in a place that makes those theories look very well founded indeed. And here's one that the creators basically handed us. In the sequel, there's a villain named Zahir, and he's strange because he starts out as a non-bender who suddenly gains airbending in that same energy shift, and yet he immediately displays this astonishing depth of knowledge about air nomad philosophy and history, far more than a brand new airbender should have. The explanation is lovely and simple. Long before he ever had a scrap of bending, Zahir was one of the scholars who devoted themselves to studying the lost air nomad culture, an acolyte, a keeper of a nearly vanished way of life. So when the power finally came to him, he already understood it better than almost anyone alive. He'd been preparing his whole life for a gift he never thought he'd receive, which is a poetic bit of character design, and it rewards you for paying attention. That's the pattern with all of these. The good theories aren't the wild ones. They're the ones that make the existing story hang together even better than it already did. A genocide that failed in secret. An ordinary man dying to protect a future hero. An old man who walked with spirits. A scholar who studied a dead culture until it came back to life in his own hands. None of it's confirmed, most of it never will be, and it almost doesn't matter, because the fun was never in being right. The fun is in a world so carefully made that thinking about it feels like it's rewarding you. A couple more quickly, because they're the fun kind. There's a lasting fascination with a character called Guru Pathik, the strange serene old man, who tries to teach Aang to unlock his energy and master the avatar state. He seems to know an awful lot about Aang, about the world, about things he has no obvious way of knowing, and fans have long theorized that Pathik is somehow connected to the previous avatars or to some deeper spiritual current running under the whole story, that he isn't just a wise old hermit, but a thread tied to something much older and much larger. The show never confirms it. It just gives him that knowing little smile and lets you wonder for the rest of your life. And then there's my favourite bit of Avatar cosmology, which the show actually does support, so it sits somewhere between theory and fact. There's an episode in a great foggy swamp where the characters meet a man who tells them that everything, all life, all people, all 4 nations are connected, like the branches of a single vast tree that only looks separate from the outside. Underneath the swamp is one enormous banyan grove tree, one organism, its roots spread out for miles, and every part of it is the same living thing. It's meant as a metaphor for the whole world. And once you've heard it, you start seeing it everywhere in the show. The way the 4 nations are really one people who've forgotten it. The way balance just means remembering that connection. The way the avatar exists, more or less, to hold all 4 branches together, so the tree doesn't tear itself apart. For a cartoon, that's a lovely and slightly profound idea to build your entire magic system around. A world that keeps quietly reminding you it's all one thing, wearing 4 different faces. There's even a daft, affectionate one about the cabbage merchant, that poor recurring soul whose vegetable cart gets destroyed in nearly every city the heroes pass through. Fans have joked for years that he's secretly the unluckiest man alive, or secretly a spirit in disguise, or secretly building a vast produce empire out of pure spite. None of it is remotely canon, obviously, but the fact that a background gag character has his own little body of fan theory tells you everything about how much this fandom loves poking at the edges of the world. When people care enough to spin theories about the cabbage guy, you've clearly made something special. That's the sort of theory I like best in the end, not the ones that catch the show out, the ones that catch you noticing how much was there all along. There's one time though when the show turned that whole instinct around and pointed it at itself, when it stopped and looked directly at its own audience and its own reputation and had a proper laugh about it. And it did it, of all places, the night before its own grand finale. Most shows, when they're about to deliver their big emotional finale, spend the episode right before it winding you up, raising the stakes, getting you tense and ready. Avatar did the opposite. The episode right before its grand, 4-part, world-deciding finale is a comedy. And not just any comedy, it's the show taking the mickey out of itself, mercilessly, for a full half hour. It's called The Ember Island Players, and the setup is simple and brilliant. Our heroes, on the eve of the final battle, go and watch a play, a theatrical production put on by a local acting troupe, based on the very adventures we've just spent 3 seasons watching. So the characters sit in an audience and watch cheap, exaggerated, wildly inaccurate actor versions of themselves stumble through a garbled retelling of the whole story so far. It's a recap episode, technically the kind of clip show thing that's usually a lazy way to fill a slot, except they turned it into a full-on self-parody, and it's one of the funniest things the show ever did. The play gets everything a bit wrong in exactly the ways fans had been grumbling about for years. Every ambiguous character trait, every bit of writing people had argued over, every "wait, are those two supposed to fancy each other or not?" question, the play just barrels straight through, loudly, for laughs. The characters watch themselves be reduced to broad, silly caricatures, and they hate it, which is of course the joke. Aang has to sit there and watch a grown woman play him, dangling on wires. Zuko watches an actor throw all his lowest, most embarrassing moments back in his face, exaggerated for comedy, and he takes it about as well as you'd expect a moody teenager to take it. There's even a running gag where the play treats the recurring background cabbage merchant, a man whose entire character is having his cart destroyed over and over, as some kind of noble, knowledgeable source. It's the show gently ribbing its own audience for caring so much about the tiny details, while clearly loving that they do. And the poster for the play, the artwork advertising it inside the show, is itself a joke, a deliberately silly send-up of the actual cover art from the first season's DVD box set. So it's a show referencing the merchandise of that same show inside an episode of that show. Layers upon layers. The people making this were plainly having the time of their lives. But here's the bit that floors me every time. The play doesn't just recap what's happened, it also goes ahead and stages an ending. And the ending the in-universe play gives you is the bad one. In the fictional troupe's version, the heroes lose. Azula and Ozai win. Aang and Zuko are killed off. The villain conquers the world, curtain falls, everyone claps. Our actual heroes sit in the audience the night before they head off to the real final battle and watch a cheerful little stage show gleefully act out their own deaths and the end of everything they fought for. That is a genuinely dark joke to slip into a children's cartoon. It's the show whispering right before the climax. You know it could still go this way, don't you? And then it aired, and the very next night the real finale came, and thankfully it went rather differently. There's a lovely little thread buried in it too, if you were paying attention earlier. The play the whole troupe is famous for, the one they normally perform, is called Love Amongst the Dragons. And that's the same play we touched on a moment ago, the one Zuko mentions his mother used to take the family to see every single year. The one that, in Ursa's own hidden backstory, she actually acted in as a young woman before her whole life was rearranged. So this daft comedy episode is secretly holding hands with the saddest mystery in the show, and most people watching it for the laughs never even notice. Planted early, paid off late. There it is again. What I take from that episode is confidence, real deep, unshowy confidence. You have to be very sure of what you've built to spend the slot right before your finale making fun of it. A shakier show would never risk it. It would be too worried about undercutting the drama, deflating the tension, reminding everyone it's only a cartoon. Avatar just went, no, we're good. We know exactly what this is. Let's have a laugh at our own expense for a bit. And then we'll go and break your heart tomorrow. And it earned that. Not many shows do. For a recap episode, an awful lot of people turned up to watch this thing. It aired to something in the region of 4.5 million viewers, the night before the finale, which for an animated show at that time was a serious crowd. And what all those people got was the show cheerfully knifing itself in the ribs for half an hour. The little details are what make it. The actor playing Aang in the in-universe production is a grown woman on wires which the real Aang finds deeply unsettling to watch. Zuko's actor is all brooding, overwrought misery, a merciless exaggeration of the character's tendency to sulk about everything. There's a whole streak poking fun at how much certain characters had been simplified over the years, at relationships fans had bickered over, at threads that never quite got resolved, every quiet complaint the audience had ever muttered. The play just says out loud, at volume, for a laugh. And the cleverest layer of it is that the joke is never mean. It never feels like the show's sneering at the people who love it. It feels like a very confident friend taking the mickey out of themselves because they know you'll get it. You only make fun of the details this specifically if you know your audience obsesses over the details, and you only do it this fondly if you love that they do. It's a love letter disguised as a roast, which is a difficult trick, and they landed it perfectly the night before they went and broke everyone's heart. Now that confidence, that surety of touch, is very much a first series thing, because when the creators came back years later to make the sequel, they walked into a completely different situation, one where they were no longer quite so trusted, and the people paying for it seemed almost embarrassed to have it. And what happened to the legend of Korra behind the scenes is, in its own quiet way, one of the strangest stories in the whole saga. The legend of Korra should have been a victory lap. Same creators, same beloved world, a brand new avatar, years of goodwill banked. Instead, watching how the network handled it is a bit like watching someone slowly, quietly, try to get rid of a gift they never really wanted, without ever admitting that's what they're doing. It started with cold feet. Nickelodeon didn't have a lot of faith in the sequel going in, so the first season was written as a complete, self-contained story. One tidy arc beginning to end, so that if it flopped, that was that. No loose threads. And it didn't flop. It did well. Fans loved it and clamoured for more, which put the creators in the slightly awkward position of having wrapped everything up and now needing to keep going. So the second season got put together in a bit of a hurry, without the runway a story like that really needs, and it ended up the weakest received stretch of the show, which is what happens when you tell people to write an ending and then ask them to keep going anyway. You can't really do both well. But the ratings thing is where it gets properly odd, and honestly, a bit sad. Because rather than getting behind the show, the network seemed to keep undercutting it. The airtime kept moving about. The promotion all but dried up. And then, partway through the third season, without any real warning, Nickelodeon just pulled it off the telly altogether. Some episodes had leaked online early, ratings had dipped, and the network's response was to yank the show from broadcast mid-season and shove the rest of it onto their website. Imagine that for a second. Imagine a network deciding that the fix for not enough people are watching this is to make it dramatically harder to find. The official line was that most of the fans were watching online anyway, so it made sense to just put it there. And look, maybe there's a grain of something in that. The industry really was shifting towards streaming. But as an explanation for hoovering a show off the air with no notice, it's a bit thin. So the fourth and final season aired almost entirely online, tucked away on a website, which more or less strangled any momentum a proper finale should have had. All the critical praise in the world couldn't fix the fact that hardly anyone could find the thing to watch it. It went out with a whimper, not because it wasn't good, but because it had been shuffled into a back room. And then there's the money, which is the detail that really stays with me. As they were making that final season, Konietzko wrote about it fairly openly. The creators got the news that their budget had been slashed, cut by roughly the cost of an entire episode's worth of animation, which left them with a horrible choice. Either let a big chunk of their crew go early, weeks before the work was done, or find some way to make the money stretch. They refused to sack the crew, so instead they were forced to make what's called a clip show, an episode largely stitched together out of footage from earlier episodes. A recap, the sort of thing you make when there's no cash left to animate anything new. There's a whole episode of the final season that exists essentially because the budget got cut and they wouldn't put people out of work over it. And Konietzko basically said as much, straight out, in a blog post explaining to fans why they were about to watch a clip show and asking them not to blame the crew. You can feel the frustration coming off it even now, which leaves the big quiet question hanging over the whole thing. Why? Why would a network work this hard to bury one of the best shows it had? And the answer most people land on is uncomfortable. Cora was growing up. It was aimed at teenagers and adults as much as kids. It dealt with heavier politics, darker themes, more grown-up relationships, and it was doing all that on a channel built, first and foremost, for small children. There's a real sense that the show simply didn't fit the shelf it was sitting on, that the network never quite knew what to do with a cartoon that had outgrown its own audience, and that rather than move it somewhere it could thrive, they just sort of let it fade. I find that genuinely maddening, if I'm honest. Not because the show was perfect, it wasn't. It's messier and more uneven than its predecessor, but because it was ambitious in ways almost nothing else on television was even attempting, and it got treated like an inconvenience for the crime of being too old for the room it was born into. You had a studio sitting on something special and privately wishing it were smaller. There's a grim little irony sitting underneath all of this too, which is that Cora was, in a way, dragged into the future against its will. Being shoved onto a website mid-run was meant as a burial, but it also made the show one of the earliest big cartoons to live primarily online, ahead of the great streaming shift that would, within just a few years, become simply how everyone watched everything. The network treated putting it online as a punishment, a backroom to hide an inconvenient thing in, and a few years later, that backroom was the main event, the place every big show in the world would be desperate to be. Cora got exiled to the future a little too early, and then got treated like a failure for arriving before the rest of us caught up. The way it got there was a bit of a shambles, mind you. Part of what triggered the whole online move was that episodes had started leaking early, turning up before their broadcast dates, which spooked the network into changing its plans on the fly. So you had this strange situation where the show's own popularity, the fact that people wanted it badly enough to go hunting for leaks, was being treated as a problem to be managed rather than an audience to be served. Which, when you say it out loud, is an odd way to run a television network. People are so keen to watch your show that they're finding it before you've even aired it, so obviously the answer is to make it harder to find. I've never quite been able to make that logic sit flat in my head, and there's one particular reason people point to, one specific thing about how Cora ended that a lot of fans believe made the network especially twitchy, because the final scene of the whole series did something that children's television, at the time, simply did not do. And whether it was brave or overdue or both, it turned that quiet little finale into something people are still talking about. The sequel ends on a small quiet image. No big battle in this final shot, the fighting's already done. Just two young women, Cora and Asami, standing together, taking each other by the hand and walking off into the spirit world side by side. That's it. That's the last thing you see. They don't kiss, nobody makes a speech, they just hold hands and walk into the light together, and the show ends. And for children's television, at that moment, that was an enormous thing. Two women, two leads, walking off into a shared future as a couple. Outlets at the time called it groundbreaking, and they weren't wrong. This was a Nickelodeon cartoon quietly closing on a same-sex relationship between its two female protagonists. And for a lot of people watching, it genuinely was a first, something they'd never seen a show like this be willing to do. Now, here's the interesting tension, and it ties right back to how the network handled the show. It's not spelled out in giant letters. There's no big declaration, no on-the-nose moment where anyone announces anything. It's told the way the whole relationship had been building for a while. through looks, through closeness, through the two of them slowly becoming the most important person in each other's lives. The creators strongly suggested it, layer by layer, but they couldn't fully explicitly put it on screen at the time. Not on that channel, not in that slot, so it arrives as subtext. Except by the end, honestly, the subtext had become so heavy, it was basically just text with the lights turned down. And the creators knew it. They didn't leave it ambiguous and walk away. Shortly after the finale aired, both of them came out and confirmed it directly, in their own words, on their own blogs. This was real. This was intentional. These two are together. This is a love story. We meant every bit of it. And we were only sorry we couldn't be even more open about it on the show itself. Which is a lovely bit of authorship, actually. Refusing to let the ambiguity give anyone an excuse to pretend it wasn't what it plainly was. You'll remember the last section, how the show got pulled off the air and shoved online. Well, this is the piece a lot of fans connect straight to that. The theory, and it is only a theory, though a fairly widely held one, is that the changing nature of Korra and Asami's relationship is part of why the network got so squeamish about airing the thing at all, that a kids' channel simply didn't know how to handle a cartoon heading toward that ending, and that the quiet burial and the online exile weren't only about ratings. I can't prove that, and neither can anyone else. But the timing and the network's obvious discomfort with how grown-up the show had become makes it a hard suspicion to fully shake. The ending itself, mind you, isn't beyond criticism, and fans have gone back and forth on it for years. Some feel the relationship, for all it meant, came together a touch quickly in those final stretches that the show didn't have the room, thanks partly to all that behind-the-scenes chaos, to give it as much space as it deserved. Others feel it was seeded carefully across the whole run and landed exactly right. I lean toward the second view, personally, though I understand the first. When you look at how little runway the creators were given, how much of the show was made under pressure and budget cuts and network cold shouldering, it's almost a small miracle they got to end it the way they wanted at all. That they managed to plant a flag that firmly, in that environment, with that little support, is the sort of thing that makes you root for them. And it wasn't out of nowhere, whatever a casual viewer might assume. If you go back and watch the last couple of seasons with this in mind, the whole thing is seeded carefully, if quietly. The two of them start as rivals of a sort, drift into friendship, and then slowly become the person each one turns to first. The one whose safety they panic over. The one they can't picture the future without. It's built the way good relationships are actually built on screen, in small moments and steady closeness rather than one big declaration. Which is precisely why the ending works. By the time they take each other's hand, it doesn't feel like a twist or a gesture. It feels like the obvious, quiet conclusion of something that had been true for a long while. That the show simply hadn't been allowed to say out loud until the very last second. It's difficult now, more than a decade on, to fully convey how big a deal that quiet little handhold was at the time. This was a mainstream animated series on a children's network, ending on two women choosing each other. Publications that had never so much as mentioned a cartoon were suddenly writing about it. People described it as a genuine turning point for what was possible in that kind of storytelling, a door being pushed open that had been firmly shut before, and a lot of young people watching saw something they had never seen on a show like this, told with tenderness and treated as completely ordinary, which is its own kind of quietly radical. The creators, when they spoke about it afterward, were lovely and clear-eyed about the whole thing. They didn't pretend it had been easy or that they'd got everything they wanted. They admitted more or less that they'd been pushing right up against the edges of what they were allowed to show, and that they wished they could have been even more open about it than they were. But they also flatly refused to let anyone downplay it or wave it away as mere friendship or ambiguity. This was real, they said plainly, and we meant it. There's something admirable in that, in creators standing behind the bravest thing their show ever did, rather than hiding behind the vagueness the network had forced on them. They planted the flag, and then they made absolutely certain nobody could pretend the flag wasn't there. Because here's the pattern that keeps repeating with these two men and this world they built. They keep trying to make something ambitious and honest, and they keep running into the same wall. Someone with the money and the power decides partway through that they'd rather have something smaller, safer, easier to sell. And the creators are left choosing between fighting a battle they can't win and walking away with their vision intact. That pattern didn't end with Korra. If anything, it got worse. Because when Hollywood came calling to turn Avatar into something bigger, into live action, into a proper blockbuster, that's where the real heartbreak lives. Twice over. In 2010, there was a live-action Avatar film, a big one, from a major studio, directed by M. Night Shyamalan, the man behind The Sixth Sense, at a point when his name still carried real weight. On paper, it should have worked. A beloved world, a proven story, a serious director, a decent budget, the kind of thing that turns a cult cartoon into a franchise. And instead it became one of the most infamous adaptations in modern film, and it very nearly took the whole thing down with it. Let's start with a detail I love because it ties this whole night together. The film wasn't even called Avatar, it was called just The Last Airbender. They dropped the word Avatar from the title entirely, and the reason is delightfully petty and completely mundane. There was another film called Avatar coming out around the same time, some little independent picture about blue aliens directed by a chap named James Cameron, and the studio didn't want their Airbender movie getting confused with it, so the actual original Avatar had to change its own name to get out of the way of the other one, which, given how tonight started, feels about right. Now, the trouble. The big, defining, impossible to get past trouble with the film was the casting. This is a world, as we've spent all night establishing, built lovingly out of Asian and Inuit cultures, from the martial arts to the clothing to the writing on the walls. The heroes are, quite plainly, children of colour, and the film cast white actors in the lead hero roles. Aang, Katara, Sokka, all played by white performers. And what made it so much worse, what really turned the anger up, was the other half of that decision. The Fire Nation, the villains, the invading empire was cast heavily with actors of colour. So you had a story about a mostly Asian world where the white kids were the heroes and the brown-skinned characters were the aggressors. People saw exactly what that looked like, and they were furious, rightly. It kicked off a proper movement. Fans organised, there was a whole campaign around it. A website called Race Bending sprang up specifically to call it out and push for a boycott. This became one of the defining examples people point to when they talk about whitewashing in Hollywood. This practice of taking roles written for people of colour and handing them to white actors. And it wasn't a small grumble in a corner of the internet. It was a real, sustained, principled objection that a lot of people never forgave the film for. And honestly, why would you? And the thing is, even setting all that aside, even if none of the casting had happened, the film just wasn't very good. The story of an entire season crammed clumsily into one movie, heavy on dull explanation, light on any of the warmth or humour that made the show what it was. The effects were rough, the 3D was pointless, the acting was stiff, the pacing was a mess. When awards season came around, it didn't get the good awards. It got the joke ones. The Razzies, the ceremony, the hands-out prizes for the worst films of the year, and the film swept them. 5 of them including Worst Picture, Worst Director, and Worst Screenplay. It even picked up a special one for the worst possible misuse of 3D, which is the kind of insult you have to work hard to earn. Here's the maddening part though. Despite all of it, the terrible reviews, the anger, the awards for badness, the film still pulled in something like £300 million worth of business worldwide. It made money. Not because it was good, but because the name meant something and enough people turned up out of curiosity or hope. And that success, on paper, could have meant a sequel. There were plans, apparently. During filming, the director had already sketched out ideas for a second film that would have introduced Azula, that magnificent, doomed character we talked about. But the backlash was so fierce, and the film's reputation so toxic, that the sequel simply never got made. The plans just went in a drawer and stayed there. And in a strange way, that's the mercy of it. Because a version of Azula filtered through that film is not a thing I ever needed to see. Better it stayed unmade. What gets me about the whole episode is how completely avoidable it was. Everything that makes the source material special. Its respect for the cultures it borrowed from. Its heart, its patience, its refusal to talk down to anyone. The film managed to strip out or actively betray. It took the single most respectful piece of children's fantasy of its era and turned it into a case study in getting adaptation wrong. For years afterward, the movie was a thing fans just didn't talk about. A wound the fandom agreed to leave alone. The way you'd step around a hole in the floor. There's a small, almost sad footnote to the whole disaster, which is that some of the actors caught up in it were genuinely talented people who deserved far better than the film they ended up in. The performer who played Zuko, in particular, went on to have a proper acclaimed career, the kind that earns serious awards attention, which rather tells you the problem was never really the people on screen. It was the whole conception of the thing, top to bottom. Good actors can't save a project that's built wrong from the foundations up, and this one was built wrong in ways no performance could fix. And for years afterward, the film occupied this strange radioactive spot in the fandom. It wasn't so much hated as simply not spoken of. When people talked about Avatar, they talked about the show, the comics, the sequel, and there was just this film-shaped hole in the conversation where the movie should have been. An unspoken agreement to pretend it hadn't happened. The creators distanced themselves from it. The fans simply boycotted the memory of it. It became the thing you didn't bring up at the party, which is a remarkable fate for a film that actually made a fair pile of money, and a good reminder that box office and legacy are two completely different things. It won at the cash register and lost everywhere that mattered, and everywhere that mattered is the only place anybody remembers. You'd think that would be the last time anyone let this happen to Avatar. You'd think the lesson would have well and truly landed. But some lessons, it turns out, have to be learned twice. Because years later, when a much friendlier home came along and promised to finally do it right, history found a way to repeat itself. When Netflix announced it was making a live-action Avatar series, the reaction was cautious hope. And the single biggest reason for the hope was this. The original creators, Mike DiMartino and Brian Konietzko, the two men who dreamed the whole thing up back in that vague brief meeting all those years ago, were coming aboard to run it. They signed on in 2018 as executive producers and showrunners. The people who knew this world better than anyone alive were going to be at the helm. After the disaster of the film, that felt like the universe correcting itself. This time, surely it would be done right, because it would be done by them. And then, in the middle of 2020, after 2 years of work, they walked away. Both of them together left the production. And they were careful and gracious and a little bit heartbreaking about how they said it. DiMartino wrote an open letter to the fans. The gist of it was that when they'd signed on, Netflix had promised to honour their vision, to support them, to let them steer the ship they'd built. And somewhere along the way, that promise stopped being kept. He said quite plainly that they realised they couldn't control the creative direction of the series anymore, and that once that was true, staying wasn't worth it, not for their happiness and not for their integrity. He called it the hardest professional decision he'd ever had to make, and being who he is, he reached for the show itself to explain it. He said he tries to be like an air nomad and adapt when things get hard, to bend rather than break, but that even an air nomad, he said, knows when it's time to cut their losses and move on, which is such a perfectly Avatar way to quit a job that I can't help but respect it. He used the philosophy of his own creation to explain why he was leaving the adaptation of it. Konietzko echoed all of it, said much the same, that the support they'd been promised never really materialised, that there was no follow-through on the promise. Now they were both careful not to spell out exactly what the creative differences were, and I think that restraint is to their credit. But the reporting that came out afterward pointed at a familiar culprit: money and vision pulling against each other. The word was that the creators wanted a bigger budget to bring their version of the world properly to life, and the streamer felt it was already spending plenty and didn't want to go further. And you can draw a straight line from that disagreement to one of the loudest complaints about the season that eventually aired, which was that the effects, the computer-generated creatures, and the bending often looked a bit cheap, a bit rushed, a bit not quite there, which is exactly what happens when the people with the vision and the people with the checkbook can't agree on what it's worth. Their departure left a man named Albert Kim as the sole showrunner, carrying the whole thing alone without the two people who'd created the world. And by his own admission, it was a daunting spot to be in, taking on something that beloved without its original architects beside him. He seems to have approached it with real respect for what it's worth, but the shape of the story was already set the moment those two walked out the door. And here's what makes the whole thing land so heavily. This wasn't the first time it happened, it was the second. Cast your mind back to the film. The reason the 2010 movie went so wrong, part of it at least, is that the creators weren't really involved in it either. And now, more than a decade later, given a second crack, promised control this time, they ended up walking away from an adaptation of their own work all over again. Same story, different studio. 2 attempts to bring Avatar to live action, and both times the people who built it found themselves shut out of the room, one way or another, and left to watch from the outside as somebody else steered their creation. There's something almost mythic about that, if I'm honest. This world they made is, at its heart, about power, about who holds it and how they use it, and what happens to the people who don't have it. And the story of adapting it keeps turning out to be about exactly the same thing. The creators, for all their talent and all their goodwill, never quite held the power. The studios did. The money did. And twice now, the men who dreamed the whole thing up have had to do the most Iroh thing imaginable, which is to accept what they couldn't change, let go of the version that wasn't theirs anymore, and walk away with their dignity rather than fight a battle they were never going to win. To be fair to the man left holding it all, Albert Kim seems to have taken the job seriously and approached the world with real care, well aware of exactly how beloved and how scrutinised the thing he'd inherited was. He's spoken about how daunting it was, about the near impossibility of following something so cherished without the people who'd created it standing beside him. You'd have to be a fool, he more or less said, not to be at least a little intimidated by that. And the series that eventually arrived did find an audience. Plenty of people watched it, plenty of people enjoyed it, and it did well enough to carry on into further seasons. But it also landed squarely in that difficult middle ground where so many of these adaptations end up. Not a disaster like the film, nothing remotely like that catastrophe, but not the definitive, gets it completely right version the fans had been praying for either. It was fine, it was decent, it was watchable, and fine is a strange, deflating word to attach to something people had wanted so badly and waited so long for. When you've loved a thing that deeply, fine can almost feel worse than terrible, because terrible you can at least dismiss and move past. Fine you have to sit with and wonder about the better version that might have existed if the 2 people who understood it best had been allowed to stay in the room. I don't find that entirely bleak though. There's something clean about walking away rather than putting your name on a compromise you don't believe in. And here's the thing, their walking away from other people's versions freed them up to go and make their own. Because the story doesn't end on that quiet, twice-repeated defeat. It turns out the two of them weren't finished with this world at all. Far from it, because here's the nice part to drift out on. The world didn't stay in other people's hands. A while back, the franchise set up its own dedicated home, a studio built specifically to make new Avatar stories properly, on animation's own terms, the way the thing was always meant to be made. And the creators, the same two men who kept getting frozen out of everyone else's versions, are back at the centre of it, making the world their own way again. There's a new animated film on the way, catching up with a grown-up Aang years after the war, dealing with what it actually means to be the last of your kind, trying to rebuild a culture that was nearly wiped out, which is the exact thread we started tugging on hours ago, if you're still awake, the survivor of a genocide, slowly bringing a lost people back. And there's a brand new series coming after it too, set even further down the line, past everything we've talked about tonight, past Korra, in a world that's been through some kind of great upheaval. It follows a young earthbender, the next Avatar in the long chain, in a world that, for once, sees her as a threat rather than a saviour. And of course the fans already have theories about her. Naturally, there's a lovely one going round that this new Avatar exists, in part, to gently undo the mistakes of the ones who came before, to repair connections that got severed, to restore what was lost. Which is the same idea really, the same one that's been humming underneath this whole story from the very start, that nothing's ever quite finished, that the losses aren't always permanent, that a culture can go underground and come back, that an ending is just a place where the next person picks up the thread. That's the thing about Avatar that I keep circling back to. It was never really a show about winning a war, it was a show about balance, and how balance is never a thing you achieve and keep. It's a thing you lose and find and lose again, over and over, forever, one Avatar handing it to the next. The comet passes, the war ends, someone new is born, who has to learn it all from scratch. On and on it goes. So there's no grand conclusion tonight, and I don't think there should be. The story's still being told. The theories are still being spun. Somewhere, right now, someone's staying up far too late arguing about a lion turtle or a missing mother, or whether the boy with the arrow on his head made the right choice. And in a little while, there'll be new episodes and new mysteries and new gaps for people to fill in the dark. And there's a neatness to it, isn't there? That the people finally trusted to carry the world forward are the same two who dreamed it up in that vague little meeting all those years ago. After the film that shut them out, after the sequel the network tried to bury, after walking away from an adaptation twice over, rather than put their names on a version they didn't believe in, they've ended up right back where they started, in charge of their own creation, making it on their own terms, in the medium it was always meant for. There's a long, patient, slightly Iroh-shaped lesson somewhere in that. You don't have to win every fight in the moment. You just have to stay who you are, let go of what was never yours to hold, and wait for the world to come back round to you. And it did. It took the best part of 2 decades, but it did. So the map keeps unrolling. New corners, new creatures drawn in the margins, new mysteries for people to stay up far too late arguing about. And the lovely thing is, none of it needs you awake for it. It'll all still be there in the morning, exactly where you left it, waiting. Which is a rather comforting thought to fall asleep on, when you think about it. That the world you love keeps going even when you close your eyes. That there's always more of it coming. Rest well. There'll be plenty left to wonder about in the morning.